we were on page 33, and I was about to wax eloquent about the fact that we all sometimes fantasize about living another life. And I thought, as I was preparing, that if you're going to have such a fantasy, you should fantasize about having Wade's life. Because we flit around the world, we visit a city here and there, we go for a hike, but Wade really travels. He goes to unusual places, he digs in, he learns deeply, he writes about it. 22 books. And because he goes for such long trips to such faraway places, we sometimes lose track, we sometimes lose touch. It's been years since I've had Wade Davis here, so I'm pleased that after a year of trying, we tracked him down. And in fact, given that we see him so infrequently, we're going to have him speak here not once, not twice, but 3 times. So this is Wade Davis. And I remind you all again that the subject is democracy and freedom of speech versus disinformation and surveillance. Thanks, Wade.
He wants to know why this podium is here. I'll tell you why the podium is here. I was sailing off the coast, the Lycian coast of Turkey about 3 weeks ago when Moses confirmed that he wanted me to speak about a subject that I had absolutely no idea about. No expertise, didn't even know what the term meant, surveillance capitalism. But you know, this man is many things, but Wiley is one of them. And he never does anything accidentally. And I realized what he was really doing was putting me as an anthropologist into your seat to try to wrap our heads around a phenomenon that most of us don't even realize is swirling around our lives and in fact dominating our lives. You know, I, like many of you, and I can tell by the demographics, that lots of us were born in the analog age. I was born in 1953 when North America made 90% of the world's automobiles, and the United States, with but 7% of the world's population, controlled at least 1/3 of the world's global economy. And hovering over all of us, of course, was a great myth of the victory in Europe and in Japan of the Second World War. And industrial might made that thing possible. And it's really incredible to think about it. You realize that in 1940, with Europe ablaze, Portugal and Bulgaria had bigger armies than the United States. Within 4 years, 16 million men and women would be under arms. Europe was ablaze. America was demilitarized. In the last year of peace, we made 3.5 million automobiles. In the next 4 years of war, we made 139. But we made tanks. So many that one factory in Detroit produced more tanks than the entire German Third Reich. And when the Japanese, within 6 weeks of Pearl Harbor, took over 90% of the world's natural rubber supply, there was no synthetic substitute. We set in motion the most massive recycling campaign in history, and only recycling rubber at 400,000 depots and growing dandelions in 43 states got us through 1944 until the synthetic chemists had miraculously found a way to create a rubber upon which our armies rolled into Berlin. Liberty ships were built. It took 4 days. The record was 24 hours. The Ford Motor Company would produce more industrial output than the country of Italy. And this, of course, was the analog world into which we were born, the economic dominance and productivity and wealth that allowed for the Treaty of Detroit, that gave us the weekend, that created this magnificent reciprocity between workers and capital, that allowed us to have schools that were good, communities that were sane. It was not a perfect world. Education was based 100% on the oppression and subservience of women. Have you ever thought of why our public schools were so good when we were kids? It's because women had no choice but to be nurses, secretaries, or teachers. So the women that are now running corporations taught us math in grade 3. That's one reason the schools were so good, but they were good. 1965, General Motors had an unprecedented market capitalization of $225 billion, and to do so, it employed 750,000 people. But then, of course, with victory and freedom came the price of freedom. a Cold War that really did have to be won. Ron Reagan was right when he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Mao Zedong had the dubious distinction of being responsible for the death of more of his own people in his lifetime than Hitler and Stalin put together. And the U.S., having created those vast armies, never really stood down. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, but also Greek, Iran, Guatemala, Salvador, Lebanon, Haiti, Russia, Laos, Cuba. Today we have American troops in 150 countries. The country has never been at peace. And then somehow the violence came home. You know, on D-Day, total Allied deaths were 4,400. This year in the United States, by the month of April, that many men, women, and children have been killed by handguns. And as we liberated the individual from the collective, which was a sociological equivalent of splitting the atom, the family itself fell apart. Young people, if they even decide to get married, speak of starting a family as if they didn't already have one. Today, the top 1% of our people control $30 trillion in assets. The bottom half have more debts than assets. The three most wealthy control more wealth than 50% of the population. And out of this kind of miasma of uncertainty and gloom, which reached its nadir in the 1970s, technology kind of rose up like an avatar. You know, digital frontier was this limitless place of the imagination. I learned about it from John Perry Barlow, who was on the frontier of all of it when he wasn't writing lyrics for the Grateful Dead. 1986, my first book came out. That was a book when cutting and pasting meant literally scissors and Scotch tape. That year, only 1% of the world's knowledge was digitized. By 2013, 98% of it. Now, I wasn't a complete Luddite. I knew about Facebook 13 years before Zuckerberg was born, because I had a real Facebook at Harvard. It was a book of pictures that you scanned through to find the pretty girls. And I remember the first time I really used the internet, you know, as a writer, it's incredible. I was describing the British Everest expeditions, and Mallory had taken off in the first great gathering at Westminster Hall in London. And I suddenly was invited to a commencement address at the American School in London, and I rushed into the hall, and all these families with their bonnets and everything, and I was about to speak. And suddenly I looked, and I realized, this is Westminster Hall. And I stopped on stage and looked up, and I thought, you know, I got it pretty right. I described the light only from the internet. And everybody was suddenly looking at me. I looked at the whole line. I've got a story for you. George Mallory sat here. Young husband was there. I threw out all my remarks because the internet had brought that alive. And that was the great promise of it. And today, Google spans the globe, an electronic platform that touches the lives of everyone. In the 15 minutes I have here, Google will process 36 million search queries, 1.7 trillion a year, 3.5 billion a day. Facebook is equally ubiquitous. And of course, as you well know, they've been buying up every conceivable platform from YouTube and WhatsApp to Instagram. And what could go possibly wrong with this new frontier? Well, the obvious problem was simple. They had no way to capitalize the vast investment. They had no way to monetize this incredible world of wonder that they had unleashed. And once they realized that the key to doing so was advertising, their eureka moment would mark not only their rise to dominance, but in fact the transformation of Adam Smith's entire economic endeavor, because it was the birth of surveillance capitalism. They recognized that only advertising could save them, and while their services were real, the millions that were drawn to those services represented their real wealth. Because with every interaction with either site, the user revealed something of themselves, raw material that could be translated into behavioral data, information that once manipulated with the mathematical wizardry of algorithms could produce predictive products that could anticipate what any one consumer would do now, soon, later, today, and tomorrow. And such predictive capabilities were worth their weight in gold. And they could be sold and bartered to companies who were willing to pay generously for any information that could predict the future behavior of consumers. And so Zuckerberg inserted advertising into the fabric of Facebook's culture, as did the people at Google. By 2016, 89% of Alphabet's revenue was from targeted advertising. Facebook received $9.2 billion of its $9.3 billion of revenue, all through advertising. Now, this happened for a number of reasons. First of all, there was a kind of neoliberal, laissez-faire economic atmosphere that was in vogue, led by the new democratic regime of Bill Clinton and Al Gore, who, as you know, invented the internet. What's more, post-9/11 culture, security trumped privacy. Security was all the rage, and surveillance and warrantless collection of personal information had become the new normal. But then there was our collective enchantment with the culture itself, this Burning Man, microdosing, TED-driven libertarian culture where mere boys became billionaires overnight, and government oversight was seen as tyranny and all regulations viewed with contempt, as passé as a 5-cent cup of coffee. And advertising was the beginning of the surveillance project, but not its end. Zuckerberg at Facebook and the Google boys at Google set out to know everything about you. As Eric Schmidt would say, we know where you are, we know where you've been, we can more or less know what you're thinking about. And they saw this as an inalienable right to claim all human experience as raw material, free for the taking, asserting the company's inviolable right to translate your individual experience into behavioral data that could be owned exclusively by them, and they could do what they wanted with that data. No transparency, no reciprocity, no compensation. And as consumers, we're kind of expected to cede our authority, relax our concerns, quiet our voices, and go with the flow, becoming habituated, as we have been, to having surveillance as part of our lives, submitting to these technological visionaries whose wealth alone allows them to lay claim to some kind of superior judgment. And whether we want any of this to occur or not is irrelevant. And just as Henry Ford's invention of mass production was only incidentally about the making of cars, this surveillance project has now been applied to other domains, and this, of course, is where it gets dicey. The collection of vast amounts of data enabled both foreign entities and political interests to micro-target audiences with the same dexterity with which corporations use advertisements to lure potential customers. And they are no longer simply the metaphor for a new future. They become gateways to a much more dark set of possibilities, because traditional media no longer are the gatekeepers of information. It's amazing, this statistic. 2/3 of Americans get their news through social media, with Facebook being the primary source for nearly half the population. And as we all know, people are more willing to trust those they believe and those they know. And so online news apps have been developed to select the kind of news we prefer. Search engines deliver search results that are customized to our own perspectives based on our previous search engine use. Facebook goes as far as to create specific algorithms that show us news that fits our preferences based on the kind of articles we have clicked like to in the past. And so to a shocking degree, people are being unable to differentiate between real news stories and sponsored content. And the more people turn to social media, the less their dexterity and their ability to distinguish becomes. And so in the 2016 election, for example, there were 760 million hits of false orchestrated lies on the internet. The top 20 most deceptive news stories earn more eyes than the top 20 true stories. And for the surveillance capitalists, none of this really mattered, because all that really mattered was traffic. All news was good news as long as it generated that traffic. Now, where any of this will lead is uncertain. You know, we can talk, as Janice did, about the hegemony of China, but until you've traveled along the corridor of this new expansion highway, until you spend time, as I have, in Tibet and throughout Africa and every corner of the world, it's difficult to grasp the power and the reach of China. You know, it's always humbling to think that the 15th century belonged to the Portuguese, the 16th to the Spanish, the 17th to the Dutch, the 18th to the French, to the 19th to the British, the 20th to the Americans, it's not at all clear to me that there'll be a second American century. Right now, the Chinese people put up with 200 million surveillance cameras. The new notion of social capital has it that every single Chinese citizen by the end of next year, will have his value measured, and those who do not conform will be registered on a public blacklist, denied school choice, even have their pets confiscated. Already in 2018, 17.5 million Chinese were denied the right to fly. 5.5 million were denied a place on the high-speed trains. And these range from people who have incurred debt, who have been socially disruptive, to those who simply pursue their religious faith, the Muslims who pray and fast during Ramadan. Now, I think for any number of reasons, North America is not going to go the way of China, but this doesn't imply that we don't face our own existential threats. When citizens can no longer distinguish facts from opinions, when everyone is entitled to his or her own interpretation of reality, we have surely entered a new dystopic frontier. Because in the post-truth political world, politicians will win office by competing to see who can tell the better lie. And if voters don't mind or don't even notice the lies, which seems to be occurring in the United States at the moment, politicians have no incentive whatsoever to be concerned with the actual needs of the citizenry once elected. And if politicians can win by lying, which seems to be the case, they can surely use lies to gain power and hold on to it indefinitely. And so of the princes of the Silicon Valley who brought us this digital age, this wonderful woman, Shoshana Zuboff, who has written this book that is kind of to this digital question what Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was to the environmental movement, she concludes her book by saying, "Our lives are scraped and sold to fund their freedom and our subjugation, their knowledge and our ignorance about what they know. Perhaps they know too much to qualify for freedom." Or to quote Thomas Paine, "Any body of men holding themselves accountable to nobody ought not to be trusted by anybody." Thanks very much. Thank you.